Hello, everyone. What is a device without a human? What is a human without a device? Where does technology stop and humanity begin? Today, we gather at ITHRA on the precipice of a digital wellness revolution and an evolution of humanity and technology converging. We gather to ask the important question of who is responsible for the future, of protecting our most vulnerable minds in the generation that was born into a digital playground. Is it us? Is it big tech? Or is it the government? Today I stand here as a digital native and a representative of the hundreds of millions of young people that engage in the digital world every single day. I still remember the first time that I downloaded social media. Like a moth to a flame, my brain was never the same. What started as a blue light of wonder, awe, and joy quickly slipped into a dungeon of dissonance and darkness. My feed began to play on my deepest vulnerabilities. I started to see content of young children promoting suicide, body image content that led me to anorexia, and I almost ended my own life because of the very device that was in my pocket. I was spending between 10 and 12 hours a day on that phone, which over a lifetime is 30 years. So what do we do about it? I realized in my darkest moment that as a young person, I had to have a consciousness shift, that no amount of drugs or sleeping would ever change my mental well-being if I did not reckon with the role that technology played in my story. So then I began to get curious. How was technology going to impact the future of generations? So I started to ask. That little idea 9 years ago was the beginning of the first nonprofit dedicated to digital wellness with young people at the forefront. Half the Story Now leads an evidence-based education program rooted in play and creativity for young children around the world. We also bring youth voices to the forefront of policy to ensure that in every room where a decision is being made about them, they are there and they are heard. Now, today we're here to address who's responsible. Where do we go from here? But before we do, I must address what's happening in the modern narrative as we consider this equation. The scientific narrative. Is social media the cause of the mental health crisis we are living in? Or is it merely just correlated? Every time I go into a policymaker's room, I often like to show these two graphs. One shows the growth of 0 to a billion users on social media. The other shows the amount of mental health issues, suicide, self-poisonings that has happened amongst young women within that very same period. While scientists are debating about this issue, what I can assure you is that this picture tells us that technology has played some role in human evolution and development. Now, let's talk about policy. As I stand here talking about how social media impacted my life, we know that a new generation is growing up and will be the first natives in the AI revolution. Technology is rapidly accelerating faster than legislation. And on a global stage, we haven't come to a consensus with how we're dealing with it. And therefore, AI has become the new arms race. So what do we do about this? We have America where we haven't passed a bill in 30 years, as you heard before. And so now states are taking this into their own hands to protect their children. But what makes a child in California more valuable than a child in Idaho? And what does it look like to live in a world where technology and TikTok is taken away? What I want us to all consider here is that it might be bigger than all of this, and that we need to consider the role of the human spirit in this consciousness revolution, the fourth turning of humanity and technology all at once. As you leave today, I implore you to ask, what are you willing to leave behind for the sake of innovating for the future? On the role of regulation, I'd like to invite my esteemed panelists to come join me to discuss this very important tension in our modern world. First up, Andrew Przybylski, who is a professor of human behavior and technology at the University of Oxford. Next up is Amy Blankson, the co-founder of the Digital Wellness Institute. And last, but certainly not least, Ayisha Piotti, the managing director at RegHorizon and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology at ETH Zurich. So I've already mentioned the what and the why we need regulation in this modern time, but as we spoke about in preparation for this session, how do we move from a world that is building policy based on reaction and move into policy based on prevention?
Well, I'll start by saying, I'm sorry for my voice. I think that this requires us to think very carefully about whether or not we want to react to technology and to our fears and kind of anecdotes and kind of things that might frighten us, or if we want to approach technology in a more proactive way, in a way that allows us to articulate our values and then test, kind of with the data that these companies generate, whether or not the changes that they make to platforms that we impress upon them, whether or not these changes actually improve the well-being and the thriving of young people. And I think that that's a fairly fundamental shift from reaction to a proactive stance.
And part of that shift is conscious collaboration and actually developing frameworks that brings policymakers, scientists, and engineers to the table. Can you talk a little bit about the frameworks that you've seen working, not only with social technologies as we know it, Ayisha, but also as AI is unfolding right before us? What's working? What do you think needs to change?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And first of all, it's a great pleasure for me to be here, so thanks for the invitation. So I do think today, when it comes to regulation, we really do have one of the biggest challenges that we face as a society. We have a very, very fast-moving technology. We have systems that are set up with regards to regulation which are not necessarily up to the mark, I would say, in terms of how we need to respond. So a lot needs to be done. Now today, AI, of course, is the forefront of these technologies, and we're having so much happening in that area. And what I can say is that we are scrambling to find the right solutions. I think we should not, we should say things how they are. Now, there are some jurisdictions in the world that have started to, move forward with something which is much more binding in terms of regulation. And EU comes to mind, and they've put in place many things like the DSA, the EU AI Act, but there are many others which are not necessarily there yet. Now, whilst I think on a geopolitical level we have things to do, what is most important is who is really in that debate. And what I would like to highlight here is that we see that on the one hand, you have, yes, the policymakers who are trying to do something. You have the industry, essentially the big tech, which is always on the table. But when you look at other stakeholders, youth, for example, right? Parents, we heard about, this morning, which was so moving. Citizens, customers, are they really there on those discussions? And I think the answer is maybe not as much as they should be. And the last thing is, even from a geopolitical level, we did a study actually at ETH, and we were looking at every single sort of policy mechanism that is out there, and where did it come from? And we realized there's a large part of the world, which is maybe Africa, Central Asia, as well as Latin America, that is not really participating in this debate. And my one thing is, we need to work together, because this is a really, really big issue, and it needs everybody to be activated.
I love that you just highlighted the amount of global consensus that is required, and that it's not only about moving forward, but also reflection.
Yeah.
One of the biggest challenges, or two, in policy right now is that, one, there are no real incentives to actually make changes within tech platforms. But we might perhaps be able to look at other challenges, like the environmental crisis, and think about tax cuts and apply them to this industry. On the flip side, we're also not measuring the impact of these policies and what the financial cost is to these institutions. One of the things that I particularly love about the work that the Digital Wellness Institute is doing is that you're going in and making macro-level changes and teaching companies about why and how this is not only good for humanity, but also business. Amy, can you tell us a little bit more about the quantification or qualification of digital flourishing and how that applies on a global scale?
I'd be happy to. Thanks, Larissa. And again, I'm happy to be here as well and to represent some of the work that the Digital Wellness Institute has been doing on this front for the past 6 years, really looking at the companies who are leading the way and doing the best job of creating digital balance for their employees. And one of the things that we've learned is that many companies will talk a big game about how important people are to their organization. But if you look at the engagement surveys that the companies are using on a yearly basis, I have yet to find a company who asks a single question about the impact of technology on its people. There might be a quarterly survey on mental health, in which case one question might be devoted to this. But the reason why the Digital Wellness Institute is calling this the missing metric is because in the last 4 years, since the start of COVID to now, there's been a 30% increase in the amount of time that workers are spending behind screens. We all thought this would change after the pandemic went away, and in fact we found that those levels have remained elevated. So a 30% shift in the way that we're going about work, which is impacting relationships, sleep, productivity, the way that we connect with one another at work, and yet not a single question on our engagement surveys that connects back to why we see so much burnout, why we're seeing decreased engagement levels. And so I think this is part of how we're aiming to quantify the missing metric by pointing to some real life questions that we can be asking to proactively begin to address this in real time.
Well, the missing metric is also that we are missing the metrics of measurement, and what gets managed is what gets measured, which for the work that you're doing is so critical. And tomorrow, for those of you that have the opportunity to stay with us, you'll hear from the Inspired Internet Pledge, which is an initiative that started in America to help get more tech companies together to actually make changes within their platforms, but also their means of measurement. Because as technology and humanity converge, we have to be thinking differently, to your point, about the emotional impact of our technology, not just the quantifiable impact on the bottom line of the business. And so that brings me, Andy, to my next big question. I know that you've done an immense amount of work spending your day in labs, really going between the data, the people that have been impacted, but also big tech. And from a regulation perspective, what are some of the biggest obstacles that researchers are facing to actually get to the bottom of this equation?
Okay, so I think easily the biggest obstacle, either to understanding the basic links between kind of how we use technology and how it impacts us, is a lack of access to data. And when I say that, it isn't to imply that there's a big vault that Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos is sitting on top of, that's all the data that we would need to finally get good regulation sorted. It's a bit more subtle than that, because as you said, these companies, they exist for the very specific reasons of making money or pleasing shareholders and possibly providing a positive experience for end users. But this type of decision, it kind of bakes into even how these companies think about their own data. They don't think about their data in terms of what might they learn about the health and the well-being of their platform or their users. They think about it in terms of engagement metrics, the kinds of things that might relate to ads or to time on platform. But this isn't necessarily the building blocks that I or someone like me would need to kind of really figure out, well, what are the features and the affordances and the algorithms that might promote or might undermine the well-being of a user. And so it's not necessarily, I mean, the lawyers are quite aggressive. They do put up many obstacles, and that can't be undersold or understated. But actually, we need to think very carefully about, well, what is the data that we would want as scientists? If we really thought that we wanted to make platforms safer for, say, young users, what would we need to learn? What would those Lego be? What would those raw material be for kind of maximizing well-being in kind of a scientifically grounded way, in a way that's very different than either the anecdotes, which I, as a parent, and we all have positive and negative ones, but also kind of on the other end of it, like if we really wanted to go beyond that to understand what's happening and to intervene, we need to articulate kind of a different standard for what we could study.
Thank you. As we think about changing technology, and Ayisha, this is important coming from your side of the work, we have to also consider that digital equity is a core component of this, and that digital wellness must be looked at as the fourth leg of this digital equity stool, so that as we are providing access to technology, we are not deepening the inequities that exist. And as AI comes to the forefront, we're already starting to see how some of these inequities perpetuate through the different features that these platforms are unleashing. And what is your perspective on how we can reduce the inequities or the biases as we're thinking about AI through conscious collaboration?
Right. So I think, thank you, for that question. Indeed, it's very true that AI, there is the other side of the argument that says, well, you know what, these inequities are already there. So, what's the big deal? Why are we talking about the fact that AI is there and it's doing it? And bias is already in the society, we're just seeing it. I think the differentiation I would make is that what AI really does, it magnifies this bias at scale. So that's the first differentiation that we should all make, and realize that yes, you can, if there is some discrimination happening due to a biased algorithm, if it is in a contained, that's okay. But when it becomes AI, it's going to be really at scale. So that's the big risk, and I think that's for those that are. Now, in terms of what has been done about it, I do think that there is movement. So we have good things that are happening, so it's not all like nobody's doing anything. We have propositions that are coming from the policy angle in terms of how we can potentially even use AI itself to take away some of the biases, right? So we have algorithms that are in fact able to identify some of them and take them away and make sure. The second thing is, of course, we're looking at policy frameworks as well, but we're also looking at solutions that are coming out of the academia, for example, right? So where am I going with this? What I'm saying is, we do need the solutions to happen. Things are on their way, but more certainly, we need more and more innovation in this area. We need more, and innovation has to happen when you get all the different voices that are going to be involved in this, right? So yes, we are moving forward. The last thing I would say is that global international organizations have a role to play in this as well, when you look at sort of equity across the board. Now, the fact that we don't have a big part of the population around the world which doesn't even have access to internet, of course, is a big problem, and we're talking about AI and algorithms. But the second thing is that, I think there was, with the ChatGPT, it was very clear that this thing became pretty much at the top of the agenda, at least in 2023, at a political level in many parts of the world. And that allowed us to have initiatives such as the G20, the G7, as well as the United Nations now, if you probably know, is also heading this UN Digital Global Compact. And one of the main aims of that is to make sure that we are inclusive and we get this equilibrium in terms of making sure that the benefits of these technologies, and we know in terms of profits of the big tech, I mean, there's very, very much, are also then equally distributed to not only within society, but also in terms of looking at it in international. So there is work being done. But I think we need to keep the eye on the ball, and we need to make sure that at the local level as well, at a country level as well, in Switzerland we have communes as well, we're looking at that issue and focusing on it.
Thank you for sharing. And in sum, what you so brilliantly highlighted for us is that technology is a social determinant of health. And we need to ensure that everyone has access. At the World Economic Forum, that was the first thing that you saw when you drove in. But as I mentioned earlier, that we're scaling access without actually scaling those harms. And in light of this conversation, because we don't have a teenager on stage, and that's who I spend the majority of my time with, I do just want to bring to light that the majority of conversations surrounding AI and innovation and the future tend to leave young people behind. And when we looked at what the greatest issues were with cyberbullying, for example, in the social media era, all that is changing now with deepfakes being the new mean comment. And the speed at which a deepfake can travel can be far and beyond faster and have far and beyond more repercussions for young children. And while that is a negative, and we must acknowledge it, on the flip side, and Amy, this comes back to you, these kids are going to have to deal with AI. It's not going anywhere. It's not, is AI going to be gone or stay? This is like being in the 90s and asking if a domain is going to be a part of the internet. And so with that, and a lot of this turning of consciousness and humanity, our work is very much so rooted in play, creativity, getting kids to think about the things beyond AI and technology that remain to be human, or how you can use AI to actually perpetuate positive consciousness, entrepreneurship, and learning. And so, Amy, you talk a lot about the role of positive psychology in changing relationships with technology on an individual, a community level, and a societal level. Tell us more about what that looks like in practice.
So the reason I've really leaned into this flourishing model has been that when you watch documentaries like The Social Dilemma, you get to the end of the documentary and it has a very important message, but then you freeze and you start to feel disempowered, thinking that the whole world is dictated by puppet masters who control our fate. And what I, as a positive psychologist, a happiness speaker, is really want to lean into is the sense of human agency, that no matter how much big tech does control so many of the aspects that have created the technology that we use today, we are not with that power. We as individuals have both consumer power as well as behavioral power to change the way that we interact with technology. And so the flourishing model came out of research that we had done at the Digital Wellness Institute to identify all of the many harms that come along with the digital era. And then we applied a positive psychology framework over it, looking at the traditional flourishing models for human flourishing, and began to look at what could a more digitally balanced, digitally flourishing society look like. And I think that's where a lot of us get stuck, actually, is we think, okay, I know all the problems, but what would it look like if I was truly thriving in the digital era? And so what we did was we actually began to cast a vision across 8 different pillars of wellness, looking at productivity, environment, communication, mental health, physical health, relationships, digital citizenship, and quantified self. And I think I repeated one in there. But the 8 different domains really focus on casting a different vision across multiple aspects of our lives, so that you can begin to recognize, oh, I might be doing really well with productivity today, but maybe my mental health is a little bit suffering. So I'm going to reallocate my mental energy and resources to bolstering those behaviors. And I think when we can recognize within ourselves when we're not flourishing, we begin to see, okay, this is when I feel my best. This is when I'm doing the best in my life.
I love that you frame it that way, because for so many children, if we introduce them to technology and only introduce it through the lens of fear, that leads to apathy, which for me, people ask what you're afraid of. I firmly believe we can't save the world through fear, but apathy is the one thing that I fear most when dealing with children, because a lot of times, like I did myself, they're numbing their emotions in their screen, and the opportunity cost of that is their emotional wellness. So giving them a framework to improve their digital wellness on that spectrum is so critical. But I also just want to highlight that what you all have created is something that we use within all the societies that we work with at Half the Story, and it's actually been a very clear way that we can incorporate and measure the health of a student population, and that it isn't all doomsday. Yes, there are many of those horrible cases that we see, but we want to ensure that we're optimizing for strengths-based solutions while also acknowledging the negatives. I saw you nodding your head a little bit during the social dilemma. As a researcher, I'm curious, right now I spoke about this a little bit earlier, there's a lot of different schools of thoughts right now as to how to best tackle this. Data is at the core of this, and it is part of the policy conversations, but not all of them. What are some of the biggest changes that you would like to see beyond getting access to data as a researcher that would allow for global collaboration?
I don't know. So I think that films like The Social Dilemma are very interesting. And I say this as a scientist, but also as a parent, because I do have the same sense of kind of, not apathy, but helplessness or hopelessness, and a sense of, feeling afraid. And I think that, insofar as works like this get our attention, maybe they're useful. But, speaking as a psychologist, I tend to think that negative emotions like that, they're very good at focusing and maybe taking action, running away from a bear or something. But they're not very good for long-term survival. They're not very good for kind of understanding your environment and being able to be adaptive and adaptable. And certainly it's completely useless if you're then a parent, because then your options are very limited in terms of, say, some form of digital abstinence. And so I think that as we approach policy nationally and internationally, it's really important for us to understand that this isn't the first time that we've had this conversation. I'm sure that you've all seen in the last month or so a lot of new, seemingly new ideas about how to deal with the digital world. Not using a phone until a certain age, not using platforms before a certain age, not allowing phones in schools under any circumstances. None of these are new ideas. In fact, every single one of these ideas has been tried in different cultural milieus at different times. For a decade, the South Koreans turned off the internet for under 18s between midnight and 6 a.m. It took them 10 years to figure out that none of the KPIs around digital well-being were met. Massive human rights implications in terms of information, and they saved less than 2 minutes of sleep and no change in test scores. A place like China, sometimes people think, a parent who maybe watches The Social Dilemma, we wish we would have a government that would limit our kids to playing for 3 hours a day, 3 hours a week of video games. We find out 3 years later, through what little data comes out of China, that there's absolutely no change in the amount of time that anyone spends playing games. Great ideas around limiting screen time. The American Academy of Pediatrics, for more than 20 years, no screen time for under 2 years old, no more than 2 hours of screen time for those who are older. That's the rule of the land in the United States when it comes to being a good parent around technology. But they found out in 2016, eventually there was enough literature reviews that showed that no, these inflexible rules don't work. There's an academic paper, the title is Virtually Impossible, because of the position that it puts parents in terms of thinking about technology in terms of time and restriction. And so I would say that, even an idea, and I'll give one more, I'm sorry, this idea that banning phones in schools will solve anything. I grew up in New York in the 1980s, before kind of not retiring, but moving to the UK for quite a long time. But in the school district where I went to school, beepers were allowed, and then they were banned. Regular mobile phones were allowed, and then they were banned. Then beepers were re-allowed. Mobile phones were banned. Then mobile phones were reintroduced. Then smartphones were banned. Then smartphones were reintroduced. And now we're talking about the 5th incarnation of heads of school and teachers kind of doing these things. So my plea to all of you, besides, and to regulators, is to not repeat the mistakes of the past, to bother learning about the fact that while a restriction might feel good, it might sound like it's easy to implement, not only will it be ineffective, it will also waste resources that could be better spent on evidence-based policies, the kinds of conversations like Steve said earlier, like in terms of actually starting a conversation about technology earlier, and kind of having that advice and that two-way communication being based in scientific evidence. That way it can be tweaked as we learn new things and as new platforms like generative AI platforms come into our children's lives, so that we can constantly revise the kinds of advice that we're giving and the regulations that we're trying to make, because we know that abstinence doesn't work.
Yeah.
And just repeating that again, it's just going to waste everyone's time.
I'm glad that you brought that to light, because for so many children, there is a double standard where they're walking into their schools, the schools are taking their iPhones, and then they're handing them an iPad and saying, you have to submit your tests, you're going to get your score in 2 seconds, and all of their anxieties are still heightened. And for many of them, they're breaking through the VPNs and accessing all of the sites that their teachers and parents don't want them to have. And so one of the big things that we've been focusing a lot on is how do we go beyond that screen time or that scowl mentality, when the reality is that for all of you that have parents up here, not all children are the same. They're built differently. They're emotionally predisposed to different things. I was predisposed to anxiety and depression. So it's no doubt that giving me a screen amplified all of those things. I know that also at the Digital Wellness Institute, you all are in the same camp as us, and thinking about screen time is more nuanced, and there's a difference between passive tech consumption and active tech consumption. And it's the idea of applying mindfulness to the digital age. Can you talk a little bit about that and the strategies, not only from a children's perspective, but also from a community and corporate lens?
Oh, I love that question. And I was thinking about this because I do have 3 teenagers, and I've tried all of the different tactics on them. They are my little guinea pigs. But I would say that of all the interventions from various apps I've tried, screen time limits, ruling on 2 hours of entertainment-related screen time, the #1 most effective strategy that I come across is talking about digital wellness nonstop with them. I mean, those children can repeat every talk I ever give on digital wellness. And I think that having that talk track in their minds is one of the most powerful tools. I see the same thing happen in corporations. We'll often work with organizations to create communication charters. And this is an opportunity for a small team to actually get together and talk about why they're communicating, how often they're communicating, what channels they're going to communicate on, and even the most digitally well organizations we work with still have upwards of 12 different ways of communicating, whether it's Slack and Teams and Zoom and email and text message and in-person and phone, and the list goes on. And so what happens is that you have different modalities. You've got different genders, ages, industries, and regions of the world, which all have a different definition of what it means to be responsive. Some think being responsive means responding in 15 minutes. Others think that it's upwards of a week. So you put these 2 individuals on a team together, they both think they're being responsive and responsible, and they're very frustrated with one another. Turns out one of the most effective solutions is not adding yet another meditation app to help them with their digital well-being. It's having a conversation, a facilitated conversation with your manager about how you're communicating, why you're communicating, and what the frustration points are. I think this goes back to being human and the importance of actually having the conversation and not just talking about the problems that we're having and having conversations. And I think that we can do a lot in this space to continue to improve, specifically from a corporate level, but also from a societal and parental level as well.
Yeah, and could I just add something, build on the couple of things that you've said already, which I think make a lot of sense. One on the positivity and the mindset change, right? So, and the other is what do we do next? So first and foremost, I really, and I say that whenever I go around, we are at an incredible moment in history where we have a real opportunity right now that policy is being made. You know, in many industries, policies, regulations are already there. So you have to comply with the law. Now we are in a situation where we can help make those legislations, right? So I find this is an incredible opportunity which each of us can seize in a positive way, right? The other thing is, when you realize that it's an opportunity, this mindset which says, well, you know what, I mean, this is not good, that is not good, but, regulators have to deal with it. I mean, you go to across the board and you always say, well, regulation will come and they will deal with it. But no, actually, regulators are also people like us, right? They're also waiting to get input from all of us for what's the best solution. And that builds to what, Andrew was saying before as well, this communication, coming back to that, right? This constant feedback like we give. I'm a proud mother of twins as well, and it's exactly the same story where you've got to talk to them and explain to them. And once you do, they actually understand. And in fact, as a society, I do believe if we do that, right, for lawmaking, and I think there can be no better process than lawmaking where you can actually discuss these trade-offs together, right? Because that's what it's all about, right? Is it going to be competition or is it going to be privacy that we want in this society? I mean, is it going to be long-term or short-term? What are the trade-offs? And the same way we discuss with our kids, we should be discussing these issues, but we need to highlight what those trade-offs are and then discuss as a society. And lawmaking is something that allows us to have that cadre, as we say in French, but you know, the box in which we can do that in a neutral and good way. And what I would say is so that communication, that collaboration, that positive mindset is what we need, not just for the children, but actually generally as a whole. And that's what you know, my wish would be that we do more of.
Yeah. Well, I love the idea of stripping away the technology and bringing more humanity to the table. We could certainly use that in every room where policies are being designed. So on our last note, I'd love to ask a rapid fire question of if you had a magic wand and you could add or subtract one feature on a platform, what would it be?
I can jump in. I've got an idea. So if we're talking about social media platforms, one idea that I would love to see is to have some sort of overlay of digital wellness coaching, especially on social media. So you've been on for a little while. It might be worth stepping away. I noticed that there have been some negative comments on your post. Would you like to handle this or get some coaching to work through this? So somebody, at least prompts that would help to connect somebody to a healthier way of processing what we're seeing in social.
Okay, I have maybe one. I think, as everybody, I mean, many people know, algorithms are there to sort of put us and show us more of what they believe we like to see, right? So more and more that happens. If I could actually have a wish, my wish would be that I should be shown on a social media something opposite to the general algorithms which I actually have as what they should be showing me. So something different, which allows me to go outside of my sort of world and see what the other world is like, right? And now I know it doesn't make a lot of money for the big tech if we do that, but that I think will help me to see what's happening in discussions outside of my realm, which could be maybe helpful and which I should be listening to. So that'd be my wish.
It's never been more important than to break out of your echo chamber than now.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I have a really interesting experience sometimes, which is I'll talk to people who work in tech firms, quite senior, junior, doesn't matter. And I've actually seen them on many different occasions ask exactly this question. But these are the people who are kind of, in their own way, holding a magic wand, because they do have, to different levels of experience and power and technical capability, the ability to change their platforms. And so, you know, you can see this in two ways, or I've seen this in two ways, one private and one public. In private, they will very excitedly talk about some of these things, kind of the productization or the toolization of ways of making their platforms better, ways of not recommending certain things, promoting other things, kind of reflecting their internal values. The second way that I've seen this is the magic wand. We actually can see this in the Facebook files, the Facebook leaks from Frances Haugen back in August of 2021, where you can actually see through leaked documents, more than 21,000 leaked documents, all the different ways that Facebook and Instagram engineers and researchers were trying to get a hold of digital well-being. And you can see all of their magic wands too. You can see a lot of their interventions. And so we've gone through these documents, and we've seen now that they did 36 studies out of these 21,000 documents, and actually 5 intervention studies. So there's 5 examples of them waving their magic wand. And some of them worked, some of them became products, some of them didn't work, but still became products. And I think that this is happening at a time where actually we have more power as users. And when we talk about the social web and the federated social web, there are already very interesting experiments. And what's happening is people are being able to use their magic wands outside of the tech company proper, but inside of the way that platform is governed.
Yeah.
So if you look at the platform Blue Sky, you can actually, it's like Twitter, it spun out a long time ago. You can actually add your own algorithms. You can curate your own algorithms in such a way that my Blue Sky is different than yours and yours. Not in that we've been driven down some digital rabbit hole, but actually that we can select for positive content. It's like an app store for this type of thing. But it's not an app store controlled by the platform. It's an affordance for us as users. And so my magic wand is out there, and I think it should happen with other platforms.
The shift from the digital rabbit hole to the digital oasis.
Yes.
Well, thank you all for joining us today. As we are at this critical turning point, not only in technological innovation, but human consciousness, it's clear that we need to have humanity at the forefront of these platforms, shifting from vocabulary of user experience to human experience and building in every sense of the way, backed by data. Thank you for joining me, and let's give our incredible panelists a round of applause.
Thank you.